It was a quiet Sunday afternoon at the Rusty Spoon, a worn-down roadside diner tucked away off Highway 18. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, just peeling paint, a neon open sign that buzzed louder than it glowed, and a gravel parking lot littered with cigarette butts and dried mud. But inside, it was a different story. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air, a low hum from an old jukebox in the corner played Johnny Cash on repeat, and the faint chatter of customers blended with the steady hiss of a grill working overtime. It was the kind of place where strangers became friends over bottomless coffee, and the waitress called you hon whether you were 18 or 80. The booths were cracked but comfortable, the tables slightly sticky no matter how hard the staff wiped them down. For the regulars, that was part of its charm. For travelers, it was a warm stop on an otherwise empty stretch of road. Henry Cole sat at the farthest booth in the corner, the one by the window. He liked that spot. It let him keep an eye on the whole room without anyone sneaking up on him. He was a man in his early 60s, though some days he felt twice that. His face was weathered and lined like a map of roads he'd traveled, hands rough and calloused from a lifetime of work. He had broad shoulders, though age had slouched them just a bit, and his jeans were faded to the perfect shade of worn-out blue. On his head, he wore a simple ball cap, its brim curved from years of being pulled low against the sun. The logo on the front had long since faded, and the stitching was frayed, but Henry never minded. Underneath the cap, his gray hair peeked out, still thick but as silver as a winter morning. He cradled his coffee mug like it was an old friend, sipping it slowly, no sugar, no cream, just black. To Henry, coffee wasn't a drink. It was a ritual. It was something you took your time with, something you could count on. He stared out the window, his sharp, deep-set eyes watching the empty road as if waiting for something or maybe nothing at all. Those eyes had seen things most people couldn't imagine, things he didn't care to talk about anymore. Not unless someone really wanted to hear. But no one ever did. To everyone else in the diner, Henry Cole was just another retiree. Another man who'd put in his years and was now spending his afternoons killing time in places like this. A man with no story, just a quiet presence. That was a mistake. The Rusty Spoon had its fair share of colorful guests. There were the truckers who stopped in to refuel both their rigs and their stomachs. Farmers who came in after long mornings tending fields, their boots tracking dirt across the floor. Families on road trips with restless kids who stared at their phones while parents checked the map. But it was never the kind of place where trouble happened. The people who came here just wanted a meal and a little peace. That peace shattered the moment the bikers arrived. The rumble came first. Low and deep, it started as a distant vibration that quickly grew into an unendurable roar. Henry heard it right away, even over the jukebox and chatter. His hand froze mid-sip as his eyes flicked toward the sound. Outside, the gravel crunched under heavy wheels. 6 motorcycles, big ones, expensive ones, pulled into the parking lot, their engines growling like angry animals. The bikes gleamed under the afternoon sun, chrome reflecting light like tiny daggers. They weren't dirty bikes, these were machines that their owners loved. Cared for. Showed off. Then came the men who rode them. 6 of them. Leather jackets, heavy boots, and tattoos that snaked up forearms and across necks. They climbed off their bikes slowly, like they had all the time in the world. There was something about the way they moved, something deliberate. A swagger that said they expected people to look and to look away just as quickly. The leader stood out the most. He was a giant of a man, easily 6'4", with broad shoulders that strained against his jacket. His beard was thick and dark, streaked with gray, and his sunglasses reflected everything back at you, so you couldn't see his eyes. His belt buckle was oversized, catching the light as he moved. He walked like he owned the pavement beneath his boots. "Here we go," someone muttered from the counter, just loud enough to hear. The door swung open, the bell above it ringing furiously, as if trying to warn the diner what had just walked in. The 6 men entered in single file, spreading out like a wave of smoke. The leader stepped in last, taking a long look around the room before removing his sunglasses and tucking them into his jacket. The diner fell silent. Carla, the young waitress on shift, froze mid-step as she carried a tray of pancakes to an elderly couple. Her hands trembled just slightly, the plate rattling against the tray, though she forced a smile as she passed by the group. The bikers paid her no attention for now. The leader's boots thudded against the floor as he made his way to the counter, where a young cook named Ricky stood flipping burgers on the grill. Ricky was barely 20, his apron stained with grease, and his ears bright red from being stuck in a hot kitchen all day. The leader leaned one elbow on the counter and spoke in a low, gravelly voice. 6 burgers. Rare. And make it quick. Ricky nodded fast, mumbling something about it being no problem. He glanced over at Carla, who hovered nervously by the coffee pot, biting her lip. The bikers spread out across the diner, claiming booths and bar stools. One sat near the jukebox, fiddling with it as though trying to decide if the music was to his liking. Another propped his boots up on a table, earning a glare from the elderly couple, who quickly looked away when he met their gaze. Henry watched it all, silent as a shadow. He kept his eyes low, his cap tilted forward just enough to shield his expression. But he saw everything: how Carla's hands shook as she poured coffee, how Ricky's spatula slipped from his hand when one of the bikers laughed too loudly. They were testing the place, seeing who would flinch. "Nice little joint you got here," one of the bikers said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he dragged his fingers across a booth's table, leaving a greasy smudge. "Real cozy." The leader's chuckle rumbled low, and his gaze swept across the diner. "Don't mind us, folks," he said, his smile wide but far from friendly. "We're just here to grab a bite. Long road ahead." No one answered. The old couple ducked their heads, staring intently at their food as if they could will themselves invisible. Carla tried to keep busy, wiping down the same counter 3 times over. Henry didn't move. Didn't speak. His coffee cup sat untouched now, steam curling into the air. One of the bikers, a wiry man with tattoos up to his jawline, suddenly stood and walked over to Henry's table. He leaned in close, his grin sharp as a knife. "You haven't said much, old man." Henry looked up slowly, his gaze steady. "Wasn't asked to." The biker laughed loudly, a grating sound that bounced off the walls. "Feisty, huh?" He glanced back at his friends, who were watching now, grinning like wolves. The leader, still at the counter, tilted his head and said calmly, "Leave him alone, Tony." Tony shrugged, though the smirk didn't leave his face. "Sure thing, boss." He gave Henry one last look before sauntering back to his booth. The leader turned toward Carla, who stood frozen with the coffee pot still clutched in her hands. "Now how about those burgers?" Henry's hand returned to his coffee, his fingers curling around the mug. Outside, the sun dipped lower, the shadow of the motorcycle stretching across the gravel like black claws. It was still quiet inside, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. Henry knew this kind of quiet. He'd heard it before, just before everything went up in flames. Henry sat in his corner booth, his weathered hand holding the coffee mug steady. He didn't drink. He just stared down at the dark liquid, listening. The bikers filled the diner with their noise, snickering, clinking their heavy boots against the floor, and talking too loud for a place like this. The leader still leaned against the counter, staring at Carla as she filled glasses of water with shaking hands. She tried not to make eye contact with him, her nervousness as clear as day. "Where's those burgers, huh?" the leader asked again, his voice just loud enough to make everyone's shoulders stiffen. Ricky, the young cook behind the counter, wiped the sweat off his forehead with his sleeve. "Almost done, sir." "Won't be long," he said quickly, flipping a patty with more force than needed. The biker smirked and turned to one of his men. "You hear that? Almost done. Maybe we should head back there and help him out." The wiry one Tony grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Sounds good to me." He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping across the floor with a painful screech, and stood up. Tony walked toward the counter, his boots thudding with every step. Ricky's face turned pale as the biker leaned his elbows on the counter and grinned at him. "You know, kid, we're real hungry," Tony said, drawing out the words. He grabbed a napkin and slowly ripped it into thin strips, his eyes never leaving Ricky. "Hungry men don't like to wait." Ricky dropped his spatula. It clanged against the metal grill, the sound echoing louder than it should have in the diner's heavy silence. Carla's breath caught in her throat, and she looked helplessly at Henry, still sitting quietly in his booth. Henry noticed. He didn't move. He didn't look up. But he noticed. Carla bit her lip and stepped toward Ricky, trying to distract Tony. "Here, sir," she said quickly, placing a glass of water down in front of him. "Your food will be ready any minute." Tony turned his head slowly, his grin widening as his eyes landed on Carla. He ignored the glass of water. "And who are you, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "You the one makin' my burger?" "And no, sir," Carla stammered. "I'm just the waitress." "Just the waitress," Tony repeated, his grin turning sharp. He glanced back at his friends, who were laughing under their breath at the scene. "Well, that's a shame. Thought maybe you could cook it yourself." "I like it extra rare." The other bikers chuckled, and Tony turned back toward Ricky, who was doing his best to keep cooking. The sound of meat sizzling filled the silence, but it wasn't enough to drown out the tension in the room. Henry tapped his thumb against the side of his mug. Once. Twice. Carla turned her back to the counter, rushing toward the coffee machine, trying to stay busy. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't want anyone to see. The leader of the bikers, who everyone now knew was the one in charge, finally turned away from the counter and walked back to his table, shaking his head with a lazy smirk. "Relax, Tony. Give the kid a break," he said. His tone sounded calm, almost reasonable, but the edge was still there. "We'll get our burgers soon enough." Tony laughed and turned away from the counter as well, heading back to his booth. Before he sat down, he looked over at Henry's booth again. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. Henry didn't look at him. He simply raised his coffee mug and took a slow, quiet sip. Tony shook his head and muttered something under his breath. It was probably another insult, but Henry didn't care enough to hear it. Across the diner, the older couple near the door exchanged nervous glances. The husband, a small man with thin white hair, leaned in close to his wife and whispered something. She nodded, clutching her purse tightly as if ready to leave. They weren't the only ones. The trucker sitting at the bar stool near the jukebox paid his bill in a hurry, slapping a crumpled 20 down on the counter and mumbling, "Keep the change." He grabbed his cap, pulled it low over his face, and slipped out of the diner as quietly as possible, not wanting to draw attention. The bikers noticed him leave, but none of them said anything. It was as if they liked the way everyone in the room was afraid of them. Henry noticed that, too. The silence was broken again when Ricky finally plated the burgers and called out, "Order up." His voice cracked on the words. Carla practically sprinted to the counter to pick up the plates. She stacked them carefully on a tray, balancing it on her arm as she headed toward the biker's booth. Her face was pale, and her smile was thin, but she did her job the best she could. "Here you go," she said softly, setting the plates down one by one. 6 burgers, just the way you asked for them." The leader didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her. He grabbed the ketchup bottle from the edge of the table and squeezed a long line across his burger, the sound loud and wet in the quiet diner. Tony leaned over his plate and sneered at the food. What's this? He said, poking at the burger bun with one finger. I said rare, didn't I? This looks medium to me. Carla's eyes widened. I am sorry, sir. I can. Relax, Tony, the leader interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Eat your food. Tony glared at the leader for a moment, but he didn't argue. He grabbed the burger with both hands and took a big bite, chewing loudly and smirking at Carla as she backed away from the table. She turned and hurried back behind the counter, where she busied herself with refilling salt shakers and stacking clean mugs. Anything to keep her hands moving. Henry's coffee had gone cold by now, but he didn't seem to care. He still hadn't looked up, but his ears caught everything. The sounds. The voices. The tone. The leader glanced over at Henry again, his eyes lingering a little longer this time. Hey, old man, he called out, his deep voice cutting through the room. You've been awful quiet back there. Don't you like the show? Henry didn't answer. The leader chuckled, shaking his head. Guess not. The other bikers laughed, their voices loud and grating. Tony, still chewing on his burger, looked over at Henry and added, he probably doesn't even hear us. Bet he's half deaf by now. Henry didn't react. He stayed still, his hand resting on the handle of his coffee mug. The leader watched him for another long moment before turning back to his food. But Henry knew it wasn't over. Men like that never let things go. Not when they wanted attention. The diner fell into a tense rhythm again. The bikers ate, talking and laughing like they owned the place, while everyone else in the diner tried to disappear. The old couple near the door whispered to each other, clearly debating whether to leave. Carla stayed behind the counter, keeping her head down as she wiped invisible stains off clean plates. Henry waited. It was a skill he'd perfected over years of practice. Patience. Observation. Quiet. He'd learned that sometimes the loudest person in the room wasn't the one you had to worry about. It was the quiet one. The one who watched and listened. The one who waited. And Henry Cole was very, very good at waiting. The tall, bearded leader of the bikers planted both hands on the counter, his leather gloves squeaking against the smooth surface. His dark eyes narrowed as he stared down at Carla, who looked smaller and more helpless with every passing second. You're telling me, he said slowly, as though daring her to repeat herself, that you don't have beer in this dump. Carla swallowed, the lump in her throat making it hard to answer. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, sir. This is a family diner. We don't serve alcohol. The leader tilted his head, the hint of a dangerous smile playing on his lips. No alcohol, huh? What kind of place is this? The bikers behind him burst out laughing, their voices filling the small diner and bouncing off the walls. The sound grated like nails on a chalkboard. One of them, Tony, the wiry man with tattoos curling up his neck and around his jawline, grinned wide, showing off teeth that hadn't seen a dentist in years. No beer and no people? What a joke. This place is dead, man. He kicked the leg of a bar stool, sending it scraping across the floor with an ear-splitting screech. The older couple by the door flinched. The wife grabbed her husband's hand and whispered something urgent, her wide eyes darting toward the exit. The husband, looking pale but firm, gave her hand a reassuring pat and stayed seated. At the corner booth, Henry Cole kept his eyes on his coffee, but his jaw tightened just a little. He didn't move, didn't look up, but anyone paying attention might have noticed his grip on the mug had shifted ever so slightly. Carla stood frozen behind the counter, clutching a towel in her shaking hands. Please, sir, she tried again, her voice shaking. You're welcome to have a soda, or a coffee. That's all we have. The leader's smile vanished like a switch had been flipped. He stood up straight, towering over the counter and Carla. His voice dropped to a low rumble, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "See Carla," she stammered. "Carla," he repeated, drawing the name out like a predator tasting the sound. "Do I look like I drink coffee? Or soda?" Carla didn't answer. Her eyes darted around the diner, looking for help. Ricky, the young cook, peeked his head through the kitchen window but ducked back quickly when he saw the look on the leader's face. The trucker who'd been sitting near the jukebox earlier had already left, slipping out when no one was looking. The leader chuckled darkly at her silence, turning his attention to his crew. "You hear that, boys? No beer. Looks like we've got a real classy establishment here." The bikers roared with laughter again, and one of them, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and a chain hanging from his belt, picked up the salt shaker from his table. "Hey, boss," he called out, shaking the salt out onto the floor like he was sowing seeds. "You want some fries with all this class?" The leader turned back to Carla, ignoring the antics of his crew. "You know what, Carla," he said, his voice syrupy and mocking. "You're right. Maybe I don't need a beer. How about a free meal instead?" Carla blinked, confused. "Free? Yeah." The leader smirked. "On the house. Right, guys?" "Yeah," the others chorused, banging their fists on their tables like wild animals. Carla took an involuntary step back, bumping into the wall behind her. Her face had gone pale, her hands white-knuckled around the towel she was holding. I can't do that," she said quietly. The leader's smirk dropped again, replaced by something much colder. "Can't," he said sharply. "Why not? You afraid you'll get in trouble?" She didn't answer. "Look at me," he demanded. Carla lifted her chin slowly, meeting his dark, unblinking stare. She didn't dare speak. The leader leaned in closer, his beard brushing against the counter, his voice a low growl. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. People like me? We don't ask. We take. Got it?" Carla opened her mouth to respond, but before a sound came out, there was a quiet scrape from across the room. Henry Cole had set his coffee cup down on the table. It wasn't much. A small movement, barely noticeable. But in the stillness that followed, it was as if the entire diner turned to look at him. The leader paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He straightened up, turning his head toward the corner booth where Henry sat. Henry didn't move. He still sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the table, the other on his lap. The faded ball cap cast a shadow over his face, but his expression calm, unreadable seemed to challenge the room. The leader stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether this old man was worth his time. Finally, he smirked and turned back to Carla. "You know what," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the diner. "Let's get out of here. This place is depressing." Tony frowned. "We're leaving? What about the food?" The leader ignored him. "We'll grab something better up the road," he said, turning to leave. But as he stepped toward the door, he stopped. He turned back to Carla and pointed a gloved finger at her, his expression deadly serious now. "Next time someone tells you to do something," he said quietly, "you listen." Carla didn't say a word. She didn't move. She just stood there, frozen behind the counter. The bikers began to gather their things, laughing and knocking chairs out of the way as they made their way toward the door. The heavy-set one with the chain kicked over a stack of menus as he passed, sending them scattering across the floor. Henry still hadn't moved. He watched the bikers with a quiet intensity, his eyes following every step they took. Tony, the wiry biker, noticed him again. He stopped at Henry's booth and tilted his head, grinning. "Hey, old-timer," he sneered. "You enjoy the show?" Henry didn't answer. Tony leaned closer, placing his hands on the edge of Henry's table. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Henry slowly lifted his eyes to meet Tony's. His voice was calm and even, barely louder than a whisper. "You're blocking the aisle." Tony blinked. For a second, it seemed like he didn't understand what Henry had just said. Then his grin widened, and he looked back at his buddies. "You hear that? Gramps here wants me to move." The bikers laughed again, but something about Henry's steady gaze made Tony pause. Henry didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just waited. Tony muttered something under his breath and straightened up, smacking the edge of Henry's table as he turned to leave. "Whatever, man. Have fun drinking your prune juice or whatever it is you old folks do." Henry watched him go, his expression unreadable. The bikers pushed through the diner's front door one by one, the bell jingling violently as they left. Outside, the roar of their motorcycles filled the air, growing louder and louder until finally fading as they disappeared down the highway. Inside, the diner was silent. Carla let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as she leaned against the counter. Ricky peeked out of the kitchen again, his face pale and his apron stained with grease. The older couple near the door finally stood up, grabbing their coats and hats and shuffling out quietly. Henry sat still in his booth, his hand back on his coffee mug. Carla turned to look at him, her face still pale. "Mr. Cole," she said softly. Henry looked up. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry didn't respond. He just gave her a small nod and turned his gaze back to the table. Outside, the diner's sign flickered weakly against the fading sunlight. A breeze swept through the parking lot, rustling napkins that had been blown from the tables. The place looked peaceful again, but the tension still lingered in the air, like the aftermath of a storm that wasn't quite over. Henry sat quietly, sipping his coffee, waiting. Because he knew they'd be back. The silence in the diner stretched on for what felt like forever. Carla busied herself behind the counter, pretending to clean, though her hands were still trembling. Ricky finally emerged fully from the kitchen, his eyes darting toward the door like he expected the bikers to come back at any moment. The older couple had long since left, but a new heaviness hung in the air, thick and unspoken. Henry Cole remained in his corner booth, still as a statue, sipping his coffee. To anyone who happened to walk in, he looked like just another tired man passing time. But anyone who paid attention to him, a rare occurrence, might have noticed something different about the way he sat. Calm but focused. Relaxed, yet ready. Carla finally worked up the courage to speak again. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Mr. Cole? You really didn't have to do that." Henry didn't look up right away. When he did, his face was unreadable, as though her words barely registered. "Do what?" Carla blinked, taken aback by the question. "You know, standing up to them. You made Tony back off." Henry set his coffee cup down with care, turning his gaze toward her. His eyes sharp and clear, with a hint of something harder lurking just beneath met hers. "I didn't stand up to anyone. I asked him to move." Carla stared at him like she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard. She opened her mouth to reply but thought better of it, shaking her head and turning back to her task. Ricky approached cautiously, wiping his hands on a greasy towel. "You think they're coming back?" he asked nervously. Henry looked out the window, toward the now empty parking lot where the bikers had left their marked napkins, tipped over chairs, and tire tracks smeared across the gravel. He considered the question carefully before answering. "They might," Henry said simply. "Men like that don't take being ignored very well." Carla froze mid-wipe, and Ricky let out a nervous laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Great," Ricky muttered. "Just what we need." Henry turned his gaze back to his coffee, swirling it gently in the mug. "You'll be fine," he said quietly. The comment might have been reassuring coming from someone else, but from Henry, It felt like a statement of fact, something inevitable and unquestionable. Carla didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders loosened just a little. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, turning the light outside a soft shade of gold. The rusty spoon grew quieter, the hum of the jukebox and the occasional clatter of dishes the only sounds breaking the stillness. A new customer or two trickled in, locals looking for their usual meals, and for a moment, it seemed like things might go back to normal. But normal never lasts long when trouble is involved. A rumble echoed faintly in the distance, low, like thunder on the horizon. Ricky froze mid-step, a plate of hash browns balanced precariously in his hands. "No way," he muttered. Carla heard it too. Her eyes darted toward the front door, and her hands instinctively gripped the edge of the counter. Henry, still in his booth, stopped swirling his coffee. He didn't look up, but his posture changed, a subtle shift, but one that suggested he'd been waiting for this very moment. The rumble grew louder, turning into the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines. One by one, the bikes pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the evening haze like sharp blades. This time, there weren't just 6 of them. There were 10. The leader, Grizzly, as some of the bikers called him, was at the front, his beard whipping in the wind as he brought his bike to a stop. The others followed close behind, their bikes forming a loose circle in the parking lot. Engines revved loudly, echoing through the stillness like a challenge. Inside, Carla's face had gone pale again. Ricky set the plate down with a clatter, muttering, "They brought friends. Of course they brought friends." Henry's eyes lifted, just a little, and he exhaled through his nose. "Figures," he said softly. The bikers cut their engines one by one, the sudden silence outside more unnerving than the noise. The leader dismounted first, pulling off his gloves and shoving them into his pocket. His dark eyes were locked on the diner as he adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the entrance. The others followed suit, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel, every step deliberate and menacing. Carla turned to Henry, panic creeping into her voice. "Mr. Cole, what do we do?" "They're coming back." Henry didn't answer right away. He reached for his coffee and took another slow sip. When he set the mug down again, he said calmly, "You keep doing your job." Carla blinked. "But..." "Go on," Henry said, cutting her off gently. "Let them come in." Carla hesitated, glancing between Henry and the door. She didn't understand how the man could be so calm, but something about the way he spoke made her believe that maybe, just maybe, he knew what he was doing. The bell above the door rang violently as the bikers stormed back in. Grizzly was first, his wide shoulders nearly brushing the sides of the doorframe as he entered. Behind him, his men filed in, their boots stomping across the floor, tracking dirt and gravel as they went. The small handful of customers who'd been quietly enjoying their meals froze. A man sitting at the counter dropped his fork with a clatter and grabbed his hat, slipping out the back door without a word. Grizzly walked right up to the counter where Carla stood, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. Well," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it isn't Carla." "Miss, we don't serve beer." Carla swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Can I help you with something?" The bikers chuckled darkly behind him. Grizzly leaned forward on the counter, close enough for Carla to smell the leather and sweat. "Yeah," he said slowly. "You can help me by apologizing." Carla frowned. "Apologizing?" "That's right." Grizzly's eyes narrowed. "You disrespected me earlier. You don't do that to men like me." Carla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes darted toward Ricky, who looked ready to bolt, and then toward Henry, who still sat silently in his booth, seemingly uninterested in the scene playing out. Henry didn't look up, but he could feel the room change. The bikers were louder this time, more aggressive, more confident. They weren't just here to intimidate, they were here to prove a point. Grizzly must have noticed Carla's glance toward Henry because he turned around, following her gaze. He spotted Henry sitting there, alone in the corner booth, and something in his expression shifted. "Well, look who it is," Grizzly said, his voice carrying across the room. "The old man." Henry didn't respond. He reached for his coffee again, lifting it to his lips with an air of total disinterest. Grizzly snorted, turning to his men. "This guy, huh? You see him earlier, Tony?" Tony, who stood near the door, nodded. "Yeah, boss. He's the one who mouthed off to me." Henry set his cup down carefully, finally looking up. His calm gaze settled on Grizzly, and for a long moment, the two men just stared at each other. Grizzly smirked. "You think you're tough, old man?" Henry's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I think you're blocking the aisle again." The bikers howled with laughter, the sound sharp and mocking. Grizzly's smile faltered, just for a second, before it came back, colder this time. "You've got a mouth on you," he said, stepping toward Henry's booth. Henry didn't move. He didn't blink. He just watched as Grizzly closed the distance, stopping only a foot away from the table. The leader placed both hands on the edge of the booth and leaned down, his face level with Henry's. "You got something to say to me, old man?" Henry tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Not really." Grizzly's smile vanished. The diner was deathly silent now, everyone holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. "You know," Grizzly said, his voice low and dangerous, "I don't like being disrespected." Henry's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Neither do I." For a split second, the two men stared each other down, the tension between them like a crackling wire. And then Grizzly did the one thing he shouldn't have done. He reached out and grabbed Henry's coffee mug. The movement was quick and aggressive, the mug scraping against the table as Grizzly yanked it out of Henry's hand. The coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the table and dripping onto the floor. Henry's eyes followed the mug as it was snatched away, his expression hardening ever so slightly. Grizzly lifted the mug to his lips and took a slow, exaggerated sip. He grimaced, then turned to his men. "Black coffee," he said with a sneer. "Tastes like dirt." The bikers laughed again, louder this time. But Henry didn't laugh. He didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on Grizzly, cold and unflinching. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. "That was a mistake." Grizzly's laughter cut off abruptly. He turned back to Henry, his brows knitting together. "What'd you say?" Henry's eyes never left him. "I said," Henry repeated, his voice steady and low, "that was a mistake." The diner was silent again. And this time, it wouldn't stay that way for long. The diner's air seemed to thicken, the hum of the jukebox now a distant whisper compared to the silence hanging between Henry and the bikers. Grizzly the leader stood just inches away, his broad frame a wall of leather and muscle. The others watched eagerly, the glint of mischief and arrogance alive in their eyes. They wanted a show, something to brag about later. Henry, now standing, didn't look particularly imposing. He wasn't a hulking man like Grizzly or wiry and scrappy like the others. He was lean, the kind of lean that comes from years of work, not the gym. He had a posture that seemed oddly relaxed for a man staring down 10 angry bikers, as though he were waiting for the rain to stop instead of a fight to break out. Grizzly's lip curled. "You think you're some kinda hero, old man?" Henry looked him in the eyes, unblinking. "I think I warned you." The words were calm, almost too calm. They made Grizzly pause just for a second before a sneer crept across his face. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." The other bikers chuckled darkly. Tony, the wiry one with tattoos crawling up his neck, nudged the guy next to him and whispered something, but his gaze never left Henry. Carla, standing frozen behind the counter, gripped a coffee pot so hard her knuckles turned white. Ricky had vanished again back into the kitchen, or maybe even out the back door. Henry didn't flinch, didn't react to Grizzly's attempts to intimidate. Instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled. Just slightly. Outnumbered. Henry said softly, the corner of his mouth twitching as though the thought amused him. It's been a long time since that worried me. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Grizzly's face. He didn't know what to make of Henry, this old man who didn't scare easily, who didn't beg or bluff. There was something in Henry's tone, something unsettling. Man, you're delusional, Tony said, stepping closer now, emboldened by the fact that Henry stood alone. You think you can take all of us? Who do you think you are? Henry tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting to Tony. Someone who knows how to pick his battles, he replied. And someone who knows how to finish them. The tension in the room climbed to unbearable heights. Every breath felt like it might shatter the silence. Grizzly had had enough. His face darkened, his patience gone. You talk too much, old man. And then, he made his move. Grizzly grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it to the ground with a loud crash, the sound ricocheting off the walls of the tiny diner. Carla jumped, stifling a yelp, but Henry? He didn't so much as blink. Grizzly stepped closer, leaning into Henry's personal space like he expected him to back down. What are you gonna do now, huh? Henry stood still as stone. He let the moment hang in the air, let the bikers get cocky, let them think he was cornered. And then, with a calm so chilling it sent a shiver through the room, he spoke. I was hoping you'd throw the first punch. The words were quiet, but they rang through the diner like a challenge. Grizzly's smirk faltered again, but this time, it wasn't anger that flickered behind his eyes. It was doubt. What'd you just say? He growled. Henry's gaze sharpened. I said, go ahead. Do it. Tony let out an incredulous laugh, looking at Grizzly as if to say, you hearing this guy? He's crazy, boss. But Grizzly didn't laugh. Something about Henry's confidence, his unshakable stillness, was starting to get under his skin. This wasn't a man afraid of losing. This wasn't a man afraid at all. You think you're a tough guy? Grizzly spat, his voice rising. Fine. Let's see just how tough you are. He lunged. For most people, that's where the story would have ended, with a man like Grizzly pinning Henry to the ground, laughing while his buddies cheered. That's what Grizzly expected, too. But Henry was not most people. The second Grizzly reached for him, Henry moved. It happened so fast that most of the bikers missed it. 1 second Grizzly was lunging forward, his hands reaching for Henry's shirt. The next, Grizzly was stumbling backward, his face twisted in shock as Henry stepped neatly to the side, his movements smooth and efficient, as though he'd done this 1,000 times before. Grizzly's momentum carried him into a nearby table, sending plates and utensils crashing to the floor. The other bikers stared, momentarily stunned. What? The Grizzly barked, trying to regain his balance. He glared at Henry, who now stood a step away, calm as ever, as if he hadn't just embarrassed a man twice his size. Henry adjusted his sleeves, his voice steady. You need to work on your footing. Grizzly roared, get him. 2 bikers rushed forward, chairs scraping against the floor as they lunged. Henry didn't hesitate. The first biker, Tony, swung wildly, a fist aimed at Henry's head. But Henry ducked low, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man his age. His shoulder clipped Tony's torso, sending the wiry man sprawling across the counter. The second biker, a broad, barrel-chested man, charged from the side, hoping to tackle Henry outright. Henry stepped back at the last second, letting the man's own weight carry him forward. With a quick twist of his arm, Henry grabbed the biker's wrist and guided him straight into a table. The whole thing lasted less than 10 seconds. 2 men were down. Grizzly's jaw hung open, and the other bikers froze, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. Henry stood in the center of the chaos, breathing steadily, not a hair out of place. "Who is this guy?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice shaking. Grizzly's face turned red, veins bulging in his neck. "I don't care who he is. Take him down." 4 bikers rushed forward this time. The diner erupted into chaos, boots stomping, tables crashing, the jukebox still humming an oblivious tune. But Henry? Henry moved like a man half his age, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He sidestepped punches, redirected kicks, and avoided every clumsy attempt to grab him. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, and precise. He didn't throw wild punches, he didn't waste energy. A quick jab to the ribs, a swift twist of an arm, a knee to the midsection, every strike had purpose. One biker swung a broken chair leg, aiming for Henry's head. Henry ducked, grabbed the man's wrist, and twisted, forcing the weapon to clatter harmlessly to the floor. The biker yelped in pain, dropping to his knees. Another rushed him from behind. Henry sensed it. He turned just in time, catching the attacker's arm and using his own momentum to flip him onto his back with a loud thud. By now, Carla had retreated to the far corner of the diner, her eyes wide in disbelief. Ricky, who'd finally poked his head out from the kitchen, stood frozen, his mouth agape. Grizzly watched, stunned into silence as his men dropped one by one. These weren't ordinary bikers, they were rough men, scrappers who'd been in plenty of fights. But Henry Cole was making them look like amateurs. Finally, only Grizzly remained standing. Henry turned to face him, his breathing steady but controlled. Around him, the diner was erect, tables overturned, broken glass scattered across the floor, bikers groaning as they tried to pick themselves up. Grizzly took a step back, his confidence gone. What are you?" Henry took a step forward. "Just a man who doesn't like bullies." Grizzly swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He glanced around at his fallen men, then back at Henry. You don't know who you're messing with," he stammered. Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "I know exactly who I'm messing with." He stepped closer, and for the first time in a very long time, Grizzly backed down. The biker leader turned on his heel, shoving past his men as he stormed toward the door. "We're leaving," he barked, his voice shaking with anger and embarrassment. "Get up. Now." The other bikers scrambled to their feet, limping and groaning as they followed him out the door. Henry didn't watch them leave. He walked calmly back to his booth, sat down, and picked up his coffee mug. It was empty now, but that didn't seem to bother him. Carla slowly approached, still staring at him in shock. "Mr. Cole, what just happened?" Henry looked up at her, his expression calm. "Just cleaning up a little mess." Carla blinked. "Who are you?" Henry smiled faintly. "Just a retired firefighter." She didn't believe him. Not for a second. Henry sat back in his booth, fingers curled around the empty coffee mug, as if the chaos of the last 5 minutes hadn't happened. The diner was quiet now, save for the low hum of the jukebox still crooning a tune from a bygone era. Broken chairs lay strewn across the floor, plates shattered, tables upturned, and 6 very battered bikers had limped out into the fading afternoon light, leaving behind stunned silence in their wake. Carla hovered near the counter, her mouth slightly open, a mix of awe and confusion plastered across her face. She held the coffee pot like it was an anchor keeping her tethered to reality. Ricky, peeking from the kitchen, still hadn't emerged completely. He looked ready to bolt at any sign of the biker's return. Henry's hands rested on the table, his weathered knuckles still flushed, though his movements were unhurried as he straightened his cap. He looked like a man who had simply stretched his legs after sitting too long, casual, calm, and undisturbed. Carla finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "Mr. Cole," she stammered, "what was that?" Henry glanced up, his expression as mild as ever, though his eyes, those sharp, steel-gray eyes, still carried the same focused intensity. "Just a little exercise, I suppose." "Exercise?" Carla gawked. You fought all of them like it was nothing." "Who are you?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the window, where the rumble of motorcycles grew quieter as the bikers disappeared down the road, no doubt nursing bruised pride and plenty of sore ribs. Finally, he spoke, his voice even and measured. "I'm just a retired firefighter, Carla. That's all." "Retired firefighter," she echoed, disbelief dripping from every word. "I don't know any firefighter who moves like that." Henry's gaze met hers. There was no boasting in his eyes, no smugness. "Sometimes the job teaches you more than just how to put out flames," he said quietly. Ricky finally crept out from the kitchen, his apron still smeared with flour from a pie he'd been baking earlier. "You took on 6 bikers," he exclaimed, waving a dish towel like a white flag of surrender. "You threw one of them like he was a sack of potatoes. What kind of training do firefighters even do?" Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It wasn't about training. It's about knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to act. Firefighting teaches you to stay calm under pressure. When a building's about to come down around you, you don't panic. You figure out where to step, where the fire's weakest, and you get out alive." The 2 younger employees stared at him like he'd just spoken a foreign language. "But," Carla pressed, "you didn't just stay calm, Mr. Cole. She stopped herself, struggling to find the words. "You knew how to fight them. Like, really fight them." Henry's faint smile flickered, as though he were recalling something far away. "Let's just say I've been in a few tight spots before." Carla opened her mouth to ask more, but Henry raised a hand, silencing her gently. "No more questions. Everyone's fine, and that's what matters." The door jingled suddenly, breaking the stillness. All 3 of them jumped, their eyes darting to the entrance. A man in a sheriff's uniform walked in, tall, with a beer belly that hinted at years spent behind a desk. Sheriff Tom Bridger. He took one look around the diner at the broken furniture, the shattered plates, and the stunned expressions, and let out a long, weary sigh. "Carla," he said, his voice tired. "I got a call about trouble." "What happened here?" Carla glanced nervously at Henry, unsure of what to say. The sheriff followed her gaze, his eyes landing on Henry, who now sat calmly with his empty coffee mug. "Henry Cole," Bridger said, squinting in disbelief. "Don't tell me you were involved in this mess." Henry shrugged, looking remarkably unbothered. "Wasn't my fault, Sheriff. Just cleaning up after some troublemakers." "Troublemakers?" Bridger echoed, looking at the wreckage. "Looks like a hurricane came through here. You telling me you did this?" Henry's lips twitched again, something that was almost a smile but not quite. "I had a little help. They were a clumsy bunch." Sheriff Bridger blinked, taking another long look around the diner. He knew Henry. Everyone in town knew Henry. Retired firefighter, widower, quiet guy who didn't bother anybody. But this was something else entirely. "Henry," the sheriff said slowly, "who exactly were these troublemakers?" "Bikers," Carla piped up before Henry could answer. "A whole gang of them. They came in here looking for trouble." "Mr. Cole, he handled it," Ricky finished for her, awe still evident in his voice. Bridger frowned, scratching his chin. "A gang of bikers? You mean those guys from out of town? The ones I warned the mayor about?" Sounds like them, Henry replied evenly. Sheriff Bridger muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Figures. I knew those boys were gonna stir up trouble. He turned his attention back to Henry, his expression cautious now. And you didn't, hurt any of them too badly, did you? Henry's brow lifted slightly. I was careful. Careful, Bridger repeated flatly, looking at the overturned tables. Right. Carla finally regained enough courage to speak up. Sheriff, Mr. Cole saved us. They were harassing everyone, messing up the diner, threatening me. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't stepped in. The sheriff looked back at Henry, squinting like he was trying to figure something out. I don't suppose you want to file a report? Henry shook his head. Not necessary. I don't think they'll be back. Bridger sighed again, clearly conflicted. Fine. I'll put out a bolo on those guys, just in case they're stupid enough to show their faces again. He turned to Carla and Ricky. You two okay? They nodded quickly. Thanks to Mr. Cole, Carla said again, her voice full of gratitude. The sheriff looked back at Henry one last time, shaking his head in bemusement. You're full of surprises, Henry. You're sure you're just a retired firefighter? Henry smiled faintly. Positive. Bridger eyed him for another moment, then grunted. Well, if you change your mind about filing a report, you know where to find me. With that, he turned and left, the bell above the door jingling once more as he disappeared. The diner fell silent again. Carla let out a long, shaky breath, placing the coffee pot back on the warmer. Ricky slumped into a chair, still staring at Henry like he'd grown an extra head. Henry, for his part, returned to his booth and sat down as if nothing had happened. Carla approached hesitantly, a pot of fresh coffee in hand. Mr. Cole, she asked softly. Can I pour you another cup? Henry looked up at her and smiled. I think I'll take that to go, Carla. She blinked, then nodded quickly. Sure thing. On the house. As she poured the coffee, Henry's gaze drifted to the window again, where the last hint of motorcycle exhaust still hung in the air. He didn't seem angry, proud, or shaken. He seemed, at peace, like a man who had done what needed to be done, no more, no less. When Carla handed him the to-go cup, he nodded his thanks. Keep the change for the trouble. She looked at him, bewildered. But you didn't cause the trouble, Mr. Cole. Henry's smile was faint but kind. Sometimes trouble has a way of finding you. With that, he walked to the door, his step steady, his shoulders relaxed. The bell jingled one last time as he left, and Carla watched him disappear down the road, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Ricky spoke up after a long pause. I don't know who he really is, but that guy's a legend. Carla could only nod, her thoughts still spinning. Outside, Henry climbed into his old pickup truck and started the engine. As it rumbled to life, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. For just a second, his expression turned somber, as if he were remembering something long buried. Then, with a quiet sigh, he shifted the truck into gear and drove away, leaving behind a quiet diner, 2 awestruck employees, and a story that no one would ever forget. The bikers froze, their bravado faltering like a candle flickering in a sudden gust of wind. Their leader, still reeling from the hit to the table, stared at Henry with a mixture of confusion, rage, and though he'd never admitted fear. Henry's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. The wiry biker groaned from where he lay sprawled on the floor, clutching his back like he'd just fallen off a moving train. Another biker, the one with the skull bandana, glanced nervously at his buddies, trying to gauge whether they still had the upper hand. They didn't. Henry stood in the center of the diner, calm and composed, as if the chaos around him had nothing to do with him at all. His frame was sturdy but not exaggerated, his posture relaxed but somehow imposing. He wasn't flashy. He didn't shout. And yet, the quiet confidence rolling off him was enough to make anyone second-guess their choices. The leader staggered upright, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You think you're tough, old man," he spat, though the trembling in his voice betrayed him. "You don't know who you're messing with." Henry raised an eyebrow, completely unimpressed. "Neither do you." For the first time, there was no laughter from the other bikers. No taunts. No smirking grins. It was as though the air had shifted, and they all felt it. The rules of this little game had changed, and the man they'd underestimated was no longer just an old guy sitting in the corner of a diner. "Get him," the leader barked, his voice breaking just a bit as desperation began to creep in. Two bikers rushed forward at once. The first came at Henry with a swinging punch, a wild, sloppy swing powered more by adrenaline than skill. Henry sidestepped smoothly, snatching the biker's arm mid-swing. With a swift, practiced motion, Henry twisted the man's wrist and elbow, guiding his momentum straight into the counter. The impact sent napkin dispensers and salt shakers flying. The second biker tried to tackle Henry from behind, but Henry spun around, catching the man's shoulders. Using the biker's own forward momentum, Henry turned his body, sending the attacker sprawling into a booth, where he landed with a loud crash, tangled up in the table and chairs. The diner was chaos now, broken dishes on the floor, chairs overturned, the jukebox still playing as if oblivious to the fight. Carla had backed into the corner behind the counter, her eyes wide as she watched the impossible unfold. Ricky had all but disappeared into the kitchen, peeking through the swinging door with only his eyes and forehead visible. But Henry? He didn't even look winded. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, looking over the remaining bikers with that same calm stare. "Anyone else?" he asked. For a moment, none of them moved. The skull bandana biker backed up a step, his eyes darting to the leader. "Boss," he muttered, the fight clearly leaving him. He's something else." The leader's face contorted in frustration. He wasn't just losing control of the fight, he was losing face in front of his crew. He couldn't allow that. With a furious roar, he reached for the closest thing to him, a half-full glass of water on the counter, and hurled it at Henry. Henry barely shifted as the glass sailed through the air and smashed harmlessly on the wall behind him. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Temper's gonna get you in trouble," Henry said evenly, his tone almost conversational. The leader wasn't listening anymore. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out a small pocket knife. It wasn't much, just a 3-inch blade, but in his hand, it gleamed like some final shot at reclaiming power. The moment the blade appeared, Carla gasped audibly. "Stop! Stop it," she cried. "This isn't worth it." The leader ignored her, pointing the knife toward Henry. "You think you're smart, huh?" he snarled, his voice cracking under the weight of his frustration and fear. "Let's see how tough you really are." Henry's eyes locked onto the blade, his expression shifting ever so slightly. It wasn't fear, no, that wasn't something Henry Cole seemed to feel. It was something sharper. A mix of focus and calculation, as though he'd already measured everything about the situation in the blink of an eye. "You really don't want to do this," Henry said quietly, his voice steady as stone. "Shut up," the leader snapped, lunging forward with the knife. It happened so fast that no one saw it clearly, not Carla, not Ricky, not the other bikers. 1 second, the leader was charging with the knife, his face twisted in rage. The next, Henry had stepped to the side, grabbing the man's wrist with one hand while his other hand delivered a swift, controlled strike to the leader's elbow. The knife clattered to the floor. The leader let out a cry of pain as his arm folded uselessly against his chest. Before he could react, Henry hooked his leg behind the man's knee and swept him off balance, sending him crashing onto his back with a thud that echoed through the diner. Henry stood over him, towering, his face calm but unyielding. "I warned you," he said softly. The leader didn't move. He just lay there, staring up at Henry with wide eyes, the fight completely drained out of him. The remaining bikers looked at each other, their resolve crumbling. One of them muttered, "Forget this. I'm outta here." "Yeah," another said quickly. "This ain't worth it." One by one, the bikers backed away, picking up their injured friends and limping toward the door. The leader was the last to move, still clutching his arm as he scrambled to his feet. He glared at Henry, his face red with shame and anger. "You'll regret this," he hissed weakly. Henry didn't respond. He just watched as the group stumbled out of the diner, their swagger gone, replaced by bruises and silence. The roar of their motorcycles echoed faintly as they peeled away, vanishing down the road. The diner fell silent. Henry exhaled slowly, as if he were releasing the last bit of tension from his body. He turned toward the counter, where Carla still stood frozen, her mouth open. Ricky had finally emerged from the kitchen, his eyes like saucers. Henry picked up his ball cap from the table, dusted it off, and placed it back on his head. Then he looked at Carla and offered a small, reassuring smile. "You okay?" Carla blinked rapidly, as though her brain was still catching up with everything she'd just witnessed. "Why yeah," she stammered. I think so." Henry nodded. "Good." Ricky spoke up, his voice shaky. What was that, Mr. Cole? Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Henry paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged. "Like I said. 25 years as a firefighter teaches you a lot." Carla shook her head, disbelief still written all over her face. "No, that's not just firefighter stuff." That was she paused, searching for the words. "You knew what you were doing. You weren't just reacting, you planned it? Like you've done it before." Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, where the sun had dipped lower in the sky. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Sometimes you do what you have to do to survive. To protect the people who need it." Carla stared at him, trying to reconcile the quiet man who sat in the corner booth with the one who'd just dismantled a gang of bikers. "Who are you, Mr. Cole?" Henry met her gaze, his expression softening. "Just a man who's seen a few fires," he said simply. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, leaving them on the counter. "For the coffee. And the trouble." Carla started to protest. "No, you don't have to." Henry shook his head. "Take it." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The bell jingled softly as he stepped outside, the late afternoon light casting his shadow long against the pavement. He climbed into his old pickup truck, the engine rumbling to life as he drove away, leaving behind a diner full of broken furniture, stunned employees, and a story they'd be telling for years. Carla watched him go, still gripping the edge of the counter. "Whoever he is," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, "I hope I never mess with him." Ricky nodded slowly, still staring at the door. "Me too." Outside, the road stretched ahead, empty and quiet, as Henry Cole disappeared into the horizon. Just another man, with just another story. The diner lingered in stunned silence long after Henry's old truck disappeared down the road, its engine fading into the distance like the closing of a chapter. Carla stood behind the counter, her hands still trembling slightly as she wiped them against her apron. Ricky, the cook, shuffled out from behind the swinging kitchen doors, finally daring to breathe now that the danger had passed. "You think they're coming back?" Ricky mumbled, his voice low. He glanced nervously at the broken tables, scattered napkins, and shards of glass on the floor. "Guys like that don't usually leave it at this." Carla shook her head. "I don't know, but," she trailed off, still staring out the window where Henry had disappeared. Something tells me they're not gonna forget him anytime soon. Forget him? Ricky huffed, scratching his head as he surveyed the wreckage. I don't even know what to think about him. One minute he's just some quiet old guy, next minute he's tossing bikers around like it's a Tuesday afternoon hobby. Carla turned to face him, her expression serious. He said he was a firefighter for 25 years. Maybe that's where he learned all that. Ricky shot her a skeptical look. I've seen firefighters do a lot of things, Carla, but I've never seen one move like that. He didn't just fight those guys. He knew how to fight. Like a soldier. Or, he paused, trying to find the words. Someone who's done that kinda thing before. A lot. Carla swallowed hard, thinking back to the way Henry moved, how calculated every step was, how he handled those bikers without wasting a single motion. It wasn't just strength. It was something far more practiced, far more dangerous. You think he was in the military? She asked quietly. Ricky shrugged. Could have been. Or maybe something else. Guys like that don't just sit around diners sipping coffee unless they're trying to disappear. The two of them fell silent, the realization heavy in the air. Henry Cole wasn't just a retired firefighter. That much was clear. Whatever his story was, it was bigger than the quiet man who sat in the corner booth and tipped generously for his coffee. Meanwhile, Henry's old pickup truck rumbled down the two-lane highway, the faint glow of the setting sun streaking across his windshield. He drove without a word, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed ahead. The quiet hum of the engine was his only companion, but that was all Henry needed. This wasn't the first time he'd had to deal with men like those bikers. It wouldn't be the last, either. People always thought the quiet ones were weak. That was their first mistake. As he passed a green road sign, one of those rusty, weather-beaten ones that mark small towns most people forgot, Henry let out a slow breath. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. If anything, he felt a small pang of regret, not for defending himself, but for being seen. Keep your head down, Henry. Stay out of trouble, he thought to himself. That was the deal he'd made. No trouble. No headlines. Just a quiet retirement. After everything he'd done, he'd earned that much. Or so he'd thought. Night fell quickly over the Rusty Spoon. The once busy little diner now stood empty, save for Carla and Ricky, who had begun cleaning up the aftermath of the fight. A broom scraped across the linoleum floor as Ricky muttered to himself. Man, how do you even explain this to the boss? He grumbled. Hey, sorry about the broken chairs. Some guy turned into an action hero on aisle 3. Carla didn't laugh. She was too lost in thought, replaying the events over and over again. Every movement Henry made, every word he said, it didn't add up. There was more to him than he let on, and Carla couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers weren't done with him yet. I'll call the sheriff tomorrow, she said finally, dropping onto one of the unbroken stools. Let him know what happened. Just in case. Ricky frowned. Think they'll come back? People like that don't take getting embarrassed lightly. She sighed. They'll want to prove something. Guys like that always do. Yeah, well, if they're smart, they'll stay far away from Henry. Ricky shook his head, dumping a broken plate into the trash. Whoever he is, he's not someone you mess with. Several miles outside of town, in a dusty lot surrounded by low bushes and broken fences, the bikers regrouped. Their leader, who'd introduced himself to his crew as grizzly for his size and attitude, paced in tight circles, cradling his arm where Henry had folded it like cardboard. I don't care if he's ex-military, ex-firefighter, or ex-ghostbuster, Grizzly growled. Nobody makes me look like that. Nobody. The wiry biker, the one with the tattoos crawling up his neck, looked less convinced. That guy wasn't normal, boss. He threw me around like I was made of paper. Grizzly spun on him, his face twisted in fury. So what? You scared of one old man? Huh? We're the Reapers. We don't back down. The other bikers exchanged glances, none of them looking particularly eager to go another round with Henry. One of them muttered, I dunno, man. Maybe we should just let it go. Cut our losses. Grizzly shot him a withering glare. Let it go? He made fools of us. You want to let that slide? What happens when word gets out that some nobody at a diner knocked us around? Huh? You think anyone's gonna take us seriously again? The silence that followed was telling. It wasn't about pride. It was about reputation. Grizzly knew it, and so did they. Finally, Grizzly stopped pacing. We're gonna find him, he said, his voice low and dangerous. And we're gonna show him what happens when you mess with the Reapers. Unaware of the storm brewing behind him, Henry pulled into the driveway of a small, worn-down house that sat on the edge of a quiet town. The place looked old but well cared for, flowers planted neatly in pots near the front steps, the lawn cut short, a rocking chair creaking slightly on the porch as the night breeze rolled through. Henry parked the truck, climbed out, and walked up the steps. For a moment, he paused, looking up at the sky. It was clear tonight, the stars brighter than usual. He didn't think about the bikers. He didn't think about the diner. He thought about how long it had been since he'd felt peace like this, even if it was fleeting. Stepping inside, he flicked on a light. The house was quiet and simple, just like Henry. A few pictures lined the shelves, most of them old. One showed a younger Henry in his fireman's uniform, standing proudly beside a fire truck. Another, smaller and more worn, showed a much younger Henry holding a little girl in his arms. She was smiling, a bright and happy smile. Henry's eyes lingered on that one for a moment longer before he turned away. He made his way to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water and setting it down on the table with a tired sigh. He sat down, leaning back in his chair as he let the stillness of the house settle over him. It was nights like this that reminded him why he'd left it all behind, why he'd walked away from the chaos, the noise, the violence. But trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding him. And this time, Henry had the distinct feeling it wasn't finished yet. The diner was eerily silent as the bikers struggled to regain their bearings. Slowly, they pushed themselves up from the floor, wincing and groaning with every movement. The leader, Grizzly, rubbed his jaw, his eyes still wide with disbelief. He'd never imagined an old man could move that fast, could have that much control. One of the bikers, the wiry guy with tattoos, glanced around, unsure of what to do. We should get outta here, Grizz. This place isn't worth it. His voice was shaky, and his hand hovered near his ribs, where Henry had sent him crashing into the floor. Grizzly grunted but didn't argue. He knew it wasn't just about getting beaten up by an old man, this was about pride, and right now, their pride was in tatters. There was no recovering from this, not in front of the people they'd tried to intimidate. It was better to leave now and save whatever dignity they had left. Without another word, they started to shuffle toward the door, some still rubbing their bruises, others just trying to stay upright. As they passed Henry's booth, one of the bikers, a big guy who hadn't said much, let out a frustrated growl. He glared at Henry, but Henry didn't flinch. He just watched them leave with quiet satisfaction in his eyes. Grizzly opened the door, his face red with anger and shame. He looked over his shoulder once, then muttered a curse under his breath before stepping out into the cold night air. The others followed, their boots clanking on the floor, leaving nothing but a trail of regret behind them. The sound of their bikes roaring to life broke the stillness of the diner. One by one, they revved their engines, peeling out of the parking lot without so much as a glance back. The tires left dark marks on the pavement, symbols of their defeat. Henry watched them go, his face calm, like it was just another day. For him, it was. Carla stood frozen behind the counter, her eyes wide, her body still shaking from the adrenaline. She'd never seen anything like that. Henry had acted without hesitation, without any need for words. He had taken control of the situation so effortlessly, so swiftly, that it almost seemed like it wasn't real. When the last of the bikers disappeared down the road, Henry turned toward the counter, his movements slow and steady. He didn't seem at all affected by what had just happened. He wasn't looking for attention or praise. He was simply there to do what needed to be done. "You okay, kid?" he asked gently, his voice steady, almost warm despite everything that had just happened. Carla blinked, a bit lost for words. She hadn't expected him to turn to her, to show any concern after everything that had just gone down. She had expected him to leave without a word, like so many others did. But Henry wasn't like the others. "Why yet?" "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice quiet but sincere. Henry smiled softly, a small but knowing grin that made him look even older than he already was. He pulled a $20 bill from his wallet and placed it down on the counter between them. It was a generous tip, far more than anyone would normally leave for just a coffee and a meal. "For the trouble," he said with a wink. "I know it's not much, but it's the least I can do." Carla was speechless. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She'd never had anyone do something like this for her. Not after all the years of working in this small town, in this quiet diner, serving truckers and travelers who never looked twice at her. Most people came and went, never even remembering her name. But Henry had made sure that even though the situation was dangerous, she wasn't left alone. She wasn't ignored. He'd taken care of things before they could escalate. Henry started to turn toward the door, his step slow but purposeful. Carla watched him for a moment, then quickly wiped her hands on her apron before rushing to the door. She had to say something, anything, before he left. "Wait, Mr. Cole," she called out, hurrying toward him. Henry stopped at the door and turned back, an eyebrow raised. "Yes." Carla hesitated, unsure of what to say. She'd never been good at putting her thoughts into words, especially not when something like this had just happened. But she knew that what Henry had done wasn't just about the bikers. It was about more than that. About respect, about standing up for what was right. "Why did you help us?" she finally asked, her voice a bit more steady now, but still filled with confusion. "I mean, you didn't have to. You could have just stayed out of it. Why did you step in?" Henry's gaze softened, and for a moment, he just stood there, as if thinking carefully about his answer. Then he gave a small, knowing smile. "I didn't do it for you," he said slowly. "I did it because some things don't need to be tolerated. People like them, they think they can take what they want, push people around because they've got the strength or the numbers. But strength doesn't make you right. And someone has to be there to show them that." Carla nodded slowly, trying to wrap her mind around his words. It wasn't the kind of answer she'd expected. It wasn't about being a hero or saving the day. It was about standing up to bullies, even if they thought they were too powerful to be touched. Henry tipped his hat, a small motion, but somehow it felt respectful. "Take care of yourself, kid. And keep that chin up. People like them, people who think they're tough, only get by because everyone else lets them." With that, he turned back toward the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Carla stood there for a moment, staring at the door as it swung closed behind him. The world outside was quiet again, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. But inside the diner, things had changed. The weight of the encounter hung in the air, but there was also a sense of relief, of closure. Carla wasn't scared anymore. She wasn't intimidated. Henry had shown her what it meant to stand up, to fight back when it mattered. She looked down at the $20 bill still sitting on the counter. It wasn't just money. It was a reminder. A reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing didn't require asking for help or waiting for someone else to fix things. Sometimes, it was about taking the first step, even when it seemed impossible. Henry Cole had reminded her of that. The next morning, the diner was busy again, the hum of conversation filling the air as truckers and locals filtered in for their early breakfasts. Carla moved about the space with newfound confidence, greeting customers with a smile that felt genuine, not forced. She still had a lot to learn, but Henry's words had stayed with her, echoing in her mind. She knew the bikers wouldn't be back. They'd learned their lesson, whether they realized it or not. But more importantly, Carla had learned something too. She wasn't just the waitress in the corner booth anymore. She was someone who had been part of something bigger, something important. And that, she thought with a smile as she wiped down the counter, was enough for today. As Henry stepped outside the Rusty Spoon, the cool evening air wrapped around him like an old friend. The faint hum of the bikers' engines was growing softer, fading into the distance as they disappeared over the horizon. He stood at the edge of the parking lot for a moment, looking out at the empty road that stretched out before him, the setting sun casting long shadows over the cracked asphalt. His hands were tucked deep into his jacket pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched as if he were trying to keep the weight of the world from settling too heavily on him. The world around him was quiet now. The storm had passed. The bikers were gone, the tension had melted away, and the diner was calm again. But the feeling from those moments still hung in the air like the scent of something burning long after the fire had been put out. Henry had always known that fire wasn't just about destruction. It was about heat, intensity, and the way it shaped everything in its path. It was about how you dealt with the flames, how you chose to face them. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, savoring the stillness. There was something comforting about it, something he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the fact that he'd done what he'd come to do. Or maybe it was the realization that, for once, he hadn't had to fight alone. For the first time in a long while, he had felt like part of something bigger than himself. The Rusty Spoon would go on. Carla would go on, stronger, perhaps a little wiser. And the world would keep turning, just as it always did. But Henry? He'd continue his quiet life, moving from place to place, a shadow passing through the spaces others forgot about. And though he wasn't looking for thanks or recognition, he knew that in the diner, in the hearts of the people who had watched that scene unfold, there was something that had changed. Something they would carry with them for a long time. Sometimes people forget, Henry muttered to himself, the words more to the wind than to anyone else. It's not about the fire you start, it's about the fire someone's willing to walk through. He paused, as if the weight of those words had caught him off guard. In his line of work, in his years of service as a firefighter, he had seen plenty of fires. Some were small, easily controlled. Others raged out of control, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But the fires that truly mattered weren't always the ones you started. No, it was the ones you faced when everything was against you, the ones that tested your strength, your will, your heart. Henry had walked through his share of fires. Some literal. Some not. The sun was beginning to dip lower now, casting a golden glow over the landscape. He turned his gaze back to the road ahead, and for a moment, he saw something else in the distance. Not just the empty street, the fading bikers, or the quiet diner. No, he saw memories, faces of men and women he had worked with, loved, lost. He saw the fires they had walked through together, each one leaving behind something precious, something earned. For years, Henry had been on his own. The weight of the past had often kept him quiet, kept him from reaching out to others. But today, he had walked through fire. And somehow, even without saying a word, he had shown people what it meant to stand firm. To not back down. To fight when necessary, but also to know when to let go and move on. As he began to walk down the quiet road, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Maybe it was the peace that followed after a storm. Or maybe it was just the simple satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, all you need to do is show up. The world didn't always need grand gestures or big speeches. Sometimes, it just needed someone to remind them that courage could come in the most unexpected forms. Henry Cole, retired firefighter, had learned over the years that there was one thing that made all the difference: resilience. Life would always throw challenges at you. Sometimes, they came in the form of bikers pushing their weight around. Other times, they arrived as fires, as accidents, as struggles no one could foresee. But the key to surviving, the key to living through all of it, was your willingness to face it head on, without flinching. Without fear. As he walked away from the Rusty Spoon, the thought lingered in his mind. Maybe that was the real lesson, the real reason behind all of it. It wasn't about always being the strongest, the smartest, or the most powerful. It was about having the courage to stand tall, even when the odds seemed impossible. It was about choosing to face the fire, to walk through it, and to come out the other side knowing that you hadn't backed down. That, in itself, was the most important thing of all. A few cars passed by, their headlights dim against the growing twilight. Henry continued on, his pace steady, his head held high. The world around him felt small in the best way. There was no need for him to rush. No need to run. He knew his place in it. And that was enough. As the last light of day disappeared below the horizon, Henry vanished into the night, the quiet town of Rusty Spoon left behind him, but forever marked by the memory of the day when a man who had walked through fire had reminded them all that sometimes, the most important battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. And that, in the end, was where true strength was found.